Propulsion continues to be normal.
RCP chamber pressure looks good.
Following up. Roger roll, Atlantic.
Water towers can fly! Yes!
Tango Delta nominal.
Flight down feed off. Bring in, feed off. Off.
Yikes. You bet. Concur. We don't need any more of these.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, it is that time of the week. NSF Live is, well, now it's live. Welcome, everyone, to this lovely little chat. We'll be talking about some fun stuff. Helping me out today, we have Chris Gebhardt. How you doing?
Doing well, Nick. How's it going yourself?
You know what? It's gorgeous. The sun's out. Clouds are out. Absolutely. Okay. And then also we have Mr. Philip Sloss. How are you doing?
Good, Nick. How are you guys doing? How's everybody doing?
Can't complain, especially since we have some new spacesuits. Like, yeah, it's kind of been a while since we've had some new spacesuits, and now we have some.
Well, yeah. Now they got to make them.
Well, you know, the renders are the spacesuits. I mean, you don't actually need to make them. It's just got to mock them up in Photoshop first. First step.
Step one, right? Yes.
Right. Now you're just trying to maintain as much value as you can. As you know, the more real the concept is, the less value it has. You're just trying to maximize, keep the potential keep the reality as close to the potential as you can.
Absolutely. Yeah. So Axiom Space got a contract along with Collins Aerospace to complete the order for some new Artemis spacesuits. What's different with these spacesuits versus the IVA suits that we've been seeing with the ISS and the old Apollo suits that went to the moon way back in the day? What's new with these suits?
Yeah. So a few things, because they're kind of multi-purpose. So if you've got any questions about the suits, get them lined up by tagging us in chat at NASASpaceflight, because yes, this is a pretty interesting announcement, and it was one that we had known about for some time, because NASA had put out a request for proposals where companies were allowed to submit different designs, different ideas that they were thinking about for these suits. But in general, what NASA was really looking for was this sort of next generation spacesuit that could do double duty, right? It can be an extravehicular activity suit or a regular spacesuit that they wear to go outside the International Space Station to do spacewalks. It can be a suit that will be used on the lunar surface for when you get out of the big fancy SpaceX moon Starship. Or lunar moon ship, as I continue to call it. But because I just think that sounds great, a moon ship with a starship. But they're basically meant to be these sort of multi-use, multi-functionality design suits, right? And one of the things that we'll need isn't just the ability to go outside the International Space Station, but to be able to pick up rocks and sustain life outside of a habitat on the moon, because that's a huge part of the Artemis program and what NASA is looking at very specifically as that next step in their space evolution, of which the ISS could really be considered step one, learning to live in low Earth orbit. And this is one of the designs. But one of the things that I found really fascinating about this, and I'm sure a bunch of other people did too, so which is why I say get your questions ready, because there were quite a few companies, aside from the two that were ultimately selected, that actually submitted designs for this and for consideration. Some of them are some pretty big names, right? Like Honeywell Aerospace. We've heard that one before. Aerodyne. And then you had some that were kind of like, oh, that's interesting. Like Axiom Space submitted a proposal, and then of course SpaceX had submitted a proposal as well for one of these suits, but SpaceX was not chosen. Axiom Space and Collins Aerospace were the two that were selected for these. And I know there were a lot of questions about that, especially since SpaceX is going to be debuting this sort of joint intravehicular IVA versus extravehicular EVA suit. The IVA suits are the ones that the crews wear during launch and landing inside of their capsules, and the EVA suits are when they go outside of the spacecraft. And I did see a lot of people questioning why SpaceX was not selected, considering they're going to be debuting one of these suits later this year on their own mission. And this is a good moment to sort of stop and go, we don't actually want SpaceX to be winning every single contract. I'm gonna paraphrase what Eric Berger said here, because he had a really good tweet about it. Because if we truly want this to be a commercial enterprise and a commercial endeavor, it can't just be SpaceX winning all of these contracts, right? Otherwise, you just have yourself another NASA, right? Where the government doesn't have options. Nobody has any other chance to come to the fore and start developing things. And as Elon has said many times, SpaceX owes its existence to that sort of funding from NASA. So giving those other companies those chances is part of this commercial enterprise that we are in. So yeah, Axiom Space, which that name probably sounds familiar because they just did the first all private mission to the International Space Station. They are sort of preparing to be the successor to the International Space Station when that program is done in 2030. Those modules will first be added to the International Space Station and then detached. So it makes sense that Axiom would win one of these contracts because they're the only ones that are there to continue permanent habitation capabilities and permanent space station research capabilities for the US and Europe and Japan, and to an extent, Russia, if they wish to come with us. I doubt that, but if they wish to, they could. Yeah, so all of that is, yeah. All of that is really there. And Collins Aerospace is actually already testing their spacesuit.
Yes.
As well. You could sort of see it. It was one of the ones we showed earlier in design. And you can sort of see what these companies are sort of going for, right? Like a blending of the Apollo and shuttle era extravehicular suit technology. You can clearly sort of see that, okay, this is one that has a lot more mobility, which will be good for stepping on things or stepping over things on the moon. But it's still sort of that same design that works with the structures that are already and the support equipment that's already there on board the International Space Station for those operations. So kind of see what they're going for here.
Yeah, absolutely. And the fact that there's already testing happening, it just shows you how fast all this is moving. And great. We're going to see some new spacesuits. I'm so excited. Like my entire life, we have the exact same IVA suits. All the old Apollo suits hasn't been something new yet.
I know, right? And we're seeing that. And one of the things that I think that's really important here too is that whatever suit is like whatever the first one like that NASA selects, right? Sort of like how they selected one lunar lander for the first lander campaign and then are opening it up outside of that, right? Whatever suit is going to be used for that landing on Artemis 3 is going to be tested first on the International Space Station and outside of the ISS. So you can sort of see how the ISS is continuing to serve that sort of vital role that it has since permanent human habitation began over 21 years ago now, is serving as that test bed, serving as that place upon which to take the first step to leap to the moon
Wow.
with a new spacesuit.
Wow.
I had to go there.
Wow.
Come on, dad jokes. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Oof. Wow.
Well, and
Awesome.
you mentioned SpaceX, which they don't get talked about very much on our channel, but
No.
I suspect they're going to continue working on their extravehicular spacesuits. They already have intravehicular spacesuits. And actually, you guys would probably know better than I would whether those can double as either pseudo extravehicular. So, for instance, the Orion suits that they're going to fly on Artemis 2, Orion has the requirement that it can sustain itself with the crew cabin completely depressurized, and so the intervehicular suits for Orion are derived from the shuttle ACES suits, but they're also going to be they have a suit loop instead of being self-contained like the shuttle suits could be. But you probably could, if you have to depressurize the cabin, then the difference between staying inside and going outside is for like the Apollo, some of the later missions, the J missions for Apollo 15, 16, 17, they would do usually I think it was during the trans-Earth transit, they would go out and pull science packages off the service module. And those were
Stand-up
done.
EVAs,
Those were done on just with keeping the suits on the internal cabin atmosphere loop. And so, these suits, I think NASA's hoping that these suits are going to replace the extravehicular mobility units, which was the shuttle era EVA suits. Which the problem is that the ecosystem to maintain those suits is I don't even know if there's a phase beyond obsolete. They just can't maintain these suits, and they're really struggling to keep the suits, the USOS on the International Space Station, the US side of the station. Those suits that go out of the Quest airlock, and you can see a shot of one here. I mean, those suits were developed in the late 1970s for shuttle, and they're still using them now. And the problem is that the parts, the supply chain, and the parts vendors are not supporting those anymore, or not going to very long. And so they need a spacesuit to do maintenance on the station for however much longer it's going to be up there.
And you can see that these suits are showing their age, right? I mean, EVAs out of the US airlock, unless it's an emergency type situation, are currently on hold and suspended, because the last EVA that we did with that Matthias Maurer from the European Space Agency was out as well in one of those suits. And issues that we've been seeing over the past decade with moisture building up, the suits leaking, Luca Parmitano earlier, about a decade ago, had a really severe incident happen with water in his suit. And of course, you might go, well, water in a suit, water on a visor helmet, what does that really matter? Well, in a microgravity environment, those water particles go airborne, so to speak, and you can end up breathing those in, and water in the lungs, where that goes very, very quickly. They're not gills. We're not designed for that. So that the oddity of saying like someone can drown in a spacesuit is real, and we're starting to see those issues start to become, I don't want to say more common, but we're starting to see them happen more often now as these suits are showing their age. That's a hard thing to say. Suits showing their age. But so needing those new ones and being able to test them here very quickly and get them online for the end of the International Space Station program, very much needed before we would be needing them for the Axiom station.
Absolutely.
Right, and then I obviously they want these suits to be the suits that are used for the Artemis 3 lunar surface activities. So Artemis 3 is still planned to be the first U.S. lunar landing with a human crew since Apollo, and they're planning on spending basically a week on the surface, the two-person surface crew, and they were planning on doing several EVAs during that time, and that these suits I believe these are the suits that NASA wants to use for this. And NASA has a pie of funding, and I think one of the other reasons that they're doing this is because there's just not that big of a slice of pie left to fund they've had a project called the XEMU project for maybe a decade. It might even go all the way back to the Constellation, because obviously they needed that. They would have needed suits back then, but they just haven't been able to get the funding for it. Once you take away the big ticket items, which is obviously SLS and Orion, And then, you start looking at things like the Gateway, and then the human land, HLS, the Lunar Lander project. There's just not that much money left, and you still are funding ISS operations at the same time. So I think they're hoping that not only will the seed funding help, but also, just like with all these other public-private partnerships that they've been doing, that you'll have less regulatory overhead for these companies who are, and if you watched the media briefing that they did with this, you have a lot of NASA people in industry now, and so so for instance, Axiom, Michael Suffredini was the former program manager for the International Space Station, and so he's intimately familiar at an executive level, but then he came up through the Johnson Space Center ranks, and so he's familiar with all of that kind of stuff. And I think I saw Dan Burbank is on the Collins. He's an advisor, I think, and he's a former astronaut. So this is sort of a natural progression in terms of how they're able to fund these things, and doing more with less, basically.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, a lot less in some cases.
Yeah.
We've got a few questions here from our super chats. Thank you all for continuing to support us. Musical Wolves has a question. Will the spacesuit contract change anything about Jared Isaacman's spacewalk? Kind of talking about that funding thing. I don't think Jared will be participating in this Artemis, right?
Yeah, you got really quiet there on my end, Nick. But if I heard the question
Oh,
right,
I'm
it's
sorry.
yeah, it was what will this new spacesuit contract? There we go. Affect the Polaris Dawn spacewalk that's scheduled from the SpaceX Dragon, correct?
Yes, absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, it shouldn't. In all honesty, it absolutely shouldn't. The only way I could kind of see that is if SpaceX had sort of oddly hedged on winning a contract in order to fund it in time. I don't know if we really see SpaceX taking that tactic so much as we see some other companies in the industry take that tactic. SpaceX definitely seems to be a company that's like, well, this is what we're doing, and if you'd like to give us funding, great. Maybe that will expedite a few things. But I don't really see NASA saying yes to Collins and Axiom as a detriment to the upcoming Polaris Dawn initiatives, because SpaceX will end up needing those suits anyway for what they themselves sort of have planned in their larger pantheon of missions that are outside of the Artemis program.
Interesting. That makes sense. What about some of the recreational sports activities that will be practical on the moon, given the 1/6 gravity? Anything that we need to take into account with that, with the new spacesuits, like maybe some good ventilation?
Yeah. I would absolutely love to see them out on a golf course testing one of these spacesuits, considering, to my knowledge, it's the only sport that's been played so far on the moon. But yeah, I mean, I think the overall idea for these suits, sort of answering it in the non-jokey question, is or in the non-jokey way, is that they are looking for these mobility units to be far more mobile and permit more mobility than by far the Apollo era suits did. You kind of saw them; they had to they kind of looked like the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man, right? When they walked and when they ran and everything, and
Yeah.
did the lunar trot and everything. So because we want crew members to be able to kneel down, because we're wanting those more what's the right word, more tactile interactions with the lunar surface this time, right? As opposed to like the grabby stick, pick up the rock, put it in the bag. We like this picture that we're showing right now alludes to, we might actually want them to take a chisel to something at some point. We might, we're asking them to interact with larger lunar vehicles, larger landers, different sorts of things. And some of these lander designs, there's quite a ladder you've got to crawl down and climb back up. So yeah, the basic element of these is not just to fold in the new technology and the new materials and the new ways of making them, but to also factor in the ability for the crew needing to be able to really move around more than the current suits allow.
Yeah, and that mobility piece is so important. Being
They'll
able
get
to,
a good workout, just like the Apollo astronauts did.
Yeah, they will.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, even the
I don't
IVA
think-
suits, the astronauts report back. It's hard to move your fingers because you're basically in this big pressurized
Oh,
bubble.
especially when it pressurizes. Yeah, moving is hard. Yeah.
Yeah.
Extra
Well, I mean, you
workout.
saw, I'm trying to, I don't know offhand some of the EVA times for especially those J missions, the 15, 16, 17 Apollo missions. But I mean, there were some shuttle EVAs that went like 8 hours, and I wouldn't be surprised if these guys, I mean, if you think about moving around, I mean, I'm old, like I can't even stand up straight for 15 minutes without having to move around. So, imagine an 8-hour workout. Because it won't be. I mean, you still have like as they say, the on the moon there's in orbit there's essentially no atmosphere, and so even though the spacesuits might be pressurized to a lower pressure than a 1 atmosphere here on Earth, it's still like moving around inside of a balloon, and so you're fighting the suit, and you're in addition to doing just your regular outdoor work activities. So they will get a real good workout when they go outside.
Maybe they'll get a pass for the treadmill for the day. They won't have to. They won't
Yeah, I
have to
think
go run
so.
around on the treadmill.
Yep.
Hey, so Scourge 31 has a question. Hard shell suits were rejected back in the 1960s. Why not go back to it now? Those bigger, bulkier metal suits instead of I think they're rubber or some kind of composite bladder suits, right? Isn't that what we used with Apollo?
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting question, right? As to exactly why. So part of what goes into suit design is how easy it is for the crew to use it, right? Because it's one thing when you have a team of 15 people standing beside a pool at the Johnson Space Center helping you into a spacesuit. It's another when you have to get into this yourself, with potentially only one other person who is also trying to get into their suit at the same time. So these things have to be these things just have to be built in ways that are easy for the crew to actually utilize them in space and not hurt themselves putting it on. One of the things, if you look specifically at old shuttle videos of the crews in orbit when they are getting ready for atmospheric reentry after the Challenger accident, and they're getting into the big orange pumpkin suits, which Philip is going to roll his eyes and give the exact name, the Advanced Crew Escape System. But they were the pumpkin suits a little bit for us there. And if you look at the videos of the crews putting them on in orbit, there's this special fabric that's inside of it so that when they actually had to bend down and like really like twist and contort their back to get into these suits, the metal ring at the top where the helmet actually connects would cut them when they were testing them. So that little bladder that was in there was to help protect their head and their ears and everything as they were putting those suits on in orbit. So you have to account for things like that in the EVA suits as well. So, when you start talking about these big bulky metal things that are hard shelled, you also have storage requirements. When they're not in use in orbit, you've got to put them somewhere, and closet space is at a minimum up there. So there are all these different things. And I mean, like, making something out of metal 40 years ago is not what making something out of metal is today. Right. I mean, the advances in technology, you can sort of look at what you've got, and the different, alloys that exist now and all those sorts of things where things can be thinner, things can be lighter, you can manufacture them differently, more cost effective. So all of that can sort of combine together into why now versus not back then. Why is this on the table? Why is it not? Yeah, it all sort of comes down to that. And then how easy it is for the crews to actually use them in space.
Well, thanks. That's a good point. I didn't even think of like the closet space there. You do gotta be careful about that. Last super chat here about the spacesuits that we'll touch on. Are the suits linked to the landing spacecraft? Because I've seen this going around on Twitter quite a bit. Richard Brown asks, the suits are linked to the vehicle due to life support connection, so Artemis 3 will use SpaceX suits, he thinks. Is that true, or how does that work?
Oh, like how they would actually interface to the vehicle, and everything.
Yeah.
Well,
Because
yeah.
Starship is assuming everything goes well. Starship is going to be
Yep.
the HLS lander, right? So
It will indeed.
would they be using these suits or SpaceX suits?
So they would be using these suits to do this. So these would be specifically for the Artemis 3 and beyond, right? NASA's press release sort of specifically stated this is for spacesuit and spacewalk systems for outside of the International Space Station, exploring the lunar surface on Artemis missions, and to prepare for human missions to the moon. So when we sort of talk about this, these are the suits that NASA is envisioning when lunar moonwalks occur. And everything like that. So the way the suits would sort of interface with the vehicle would be something that NASA would hand that requirement to the people building the lunar landers. In this case, it's SpaceX for Artemis 3. Beyond that, it could be SpaceX and whoever the second company chosen is. There are quite a few who are petitioning for that right now. Basically, this is one of those scenarios where NASA says, here is the requirement, and they have to go implement it.
Right.
Okay.
They'll define an interface, and all the spacesuit vendors will have to be able to, because especially since we're talking about such a large spacecraft for the Starship that's going to land on the moon, they might not wear self-contained suits during the landing. They might be just in a short sleeve environment for landing. And then only change into these suits when they need to. And so, you'll still need to, I don't know what kind of, you might not have to do as much of a pre-breathe protocol, depending on the way that the atmosphere is set up, but they will they won't want to use suit resources until they'll want to disconnect from them as shortly before they go outside. So for instance, like batteries, for instance, you probably want to stay on the spacecraft electrical system until you're ready to go out. So they'll be hooked up to, just like with the spacesuits in the space station, they've got plug-in ports for the EMUs for the Quest airlock, and I'm sure the Russian suits are the same way. So whether these suits fly on one spacecraft or another, I guess it's even possible that they might try and make sure that Orion at some point could interface with these suits. I wouldn't be surprised if that requirement ends up with Orion at some point too.
Interesting. Yeah, and have them transferable. Last thing you'd want to get, last position you'd want to be in is be all the way at the moon and not have something compatible with something. I seem to remember a certain
right. Remember Apollo 13 with the
13th
with the
one,
square with
lithium
the carbon
hydroxide.
dioxide scrubbers.
Yeah. Important. So SpaceX has been awarded 5 additional new Crew Dragon missions. That kind of pivoting away from the spacesuits here. That is kind of cool. We've been seeing them launch. What are they on? 6 crewed missions so far, between 4 NASA crew missions, Axiom, and no, is it 7? Because DM1. We had 7. Okay,
so we had DM2, 4 crew flights, which brings us to 5, Inspiration 4, and Axiom. So yes, we're at 7 right now.
7. Okay, cool. So there's 5 more coming down the line, which is kind of exciting.
Yeah, and this is sort of in addition to the 3 that were already announced and added to SpaceX's overall cadre of contracts, extension of contracts that they have for NASA for crew transportation. NASA had so the way the commercial crew program sort of worked, there were 2 demonstration flights and 6 what were called post-certification missions. And each company sort of gets to call those post-certification missions what they want. So for SpaceX, those are the Crew 1, Crew 2, Crew 3 flights. And I believe the Starliner ones will be called Starliner 1, Starliner 2, Starliner 3 in that regard. But NASA, they were already under contract with NASA out through Crew 6. And then 7, 8, and 9 were added back in February, and now 5 more are being added as part of the initiative to ensure that they have the transportation needs that they know they will require for the ISS operations out through 2030. Now, it's very interestingly in this, and of course, well, not very interestingly in this, I would say very obviously in this, they did make reference to the fact that, this contract does not preclude them from adding other flights, both either from SpaceX or from other providers. In fact, ideally, what NASA is looking for is to not necessarily need to go back to SpaceX to add more missions unless crew requirements change, but to actually begin adding some to Boeing's contracts, right, for Starliner, because they want the dissimilar redundancy. They want Starliner and Dragon to be overlapping and sort of trading off in their duties to the International Space Station. It's just taken a lot longer to get there because of the issues that we saw with the first orbital flight test for Boeing. But overall for SpaceX, I mean, this is mighty impressive, because if my math is correct, that gets us to crew 14.
Wow.
With that
Wow.
in those sort of contracts, and you can see that there's probably going to be quite a bit more than that, right? Because those are just the NASA ones, right? We've still got other Axiom flights to come, other potential private astronaut missions to the International Space Station that might wish to utilize the Dragon vehicle as well. And then, of course, once Starliner is fully certified here after its crew flight test, either later this year or early next year, if the schedules sort of hold, that's, you can see the sort of cadence that NASA is thinking that they'll need, and the number of flights they're thinking they'll need out through 2030 here.
That's really encouraging.
It really is. Yeah.
There's a future to all this stuff. there's something coming.
Yeah, there really is. There really is. And
14 of them.
Yeah, 14 of them. And so yeah, and this is all sort of part of what NASA had envisioned, right? Was, those 6 post-certification missions would only really have worked if the ISS was going to be decommissioned in 2024, which sort of, as the commercial crew program was in its infancy and was getting going, we sort of already knew was not going to be a thing, that they were going to really fly this thing as long as possible, or now until its successor can first be attached to it.
That's
and then detached
somehow cooler.
Yes.
That's
yes.
somehow cooler.
Yes. Well, and you know what? I'm just happy because we finally learned the lesson. No gap in capability between programs. So
yes,
make it a reality.
Yes.
But yes, this is all part of the overall plan. It was never just going to be 6 and done. It was going to be the first 6 under contract, and then add for each provider as needed as you go forward. And then allow those providers to go to other destinations too, like Starliner for orbital reef. Will almost certainly be that. I mean, that is going to be that vehicle's crew transportation vehicle. So yeah, I mean, all exactly what NASA wanted, right? To be one customer of many.
That's so cool that all this work and effort and pivoting away from cost plus and towards this new era of space is kind of starting to all pay off here.
Yes, and that's a very important thing to sort of mention. These additional contracts are in that firm fixed priced range,
Nice.
right? That SpaceX has made a big deal about, that the entire commercial crew program has been about, right? And is the reason we heard many, many times in the OFT2 launch campaign for Starliner last month that this was Boeing, right? That like NASA paid for one, Boeing had to pay for the second one, because it's not cost plus for them or for anyone.
That is so good. I have an awesome question here from the Outdoorsman Show, which is perfectly related to my favorite thing on planet Earth, which I definitely don't have hanging behind my behind my head here. But if NASA does a 3rd round of commercial contracts for cargo resupply, do you think Starship could be involved?
That's a really good question. I think that would ultimately come down to what was SpaceX wanting in terms of development cost, because there's something very interesting here if we do get to a 3rd round. So that would be Commercial Resupply Services 3, or CRS 3, which is when it does, which is fun fact, when it's CRS 3 with no dash, just CRS 3 altogether, no spaces, it means the commercial contracts that NASA has. CRS dash and a number is a SpaceX mission under those contracts. So if it has a dash, it's a
okay.
mission. If it doesn't have a dash, it's the contracts. So the third round of commercial contracts could get very interesting because NASA already has 3 providers in SpaceX, Northrop Grumman and Sierra Nevada or Sierra Space. They just changed their name. Sierra Space, I think, is what they're called now, with the Dream Chaser cargo vehicle. So instead of putting out a sort of request for proposals for new designs, new vehicles, NASA could just issue a request for proposals saying, hey, if you've already got a contract with us, do you want to bid on a third round? And they could go that way. There's no actual requirement that they open it up to new entities. Opening it up to new entities would obviously give other entities a chance to get a foothold in the door. But if NASA's sort of looking at this going, okay, we've already sort of given SpaceX and Northrop Grumman extensions to the CRS-2 contract, which sort of mimics how they did CRS-1. They could end up just going to the 3 providers and extending again. They could just open it up to those 3. Very good question. Starship is such overkill for the International Space Station, though. I see where you're going because it's cheap. It's potentially the cheapest of all of the options. But you'd literally be talking about launching something with a habitable volume of the International Space Station to resupply the International Space Station. And I know this sounds weird, but because it's microgravity, but you do have to account for docking loads, right? And how the docking interfaces between the vehicles actually react to one another.
True.
Because if you listen to how Dragon and Starliners dock with one another, there's always this moment where they say, where as soon as contact is made, the station enters free drift, and they immediately start talking about that. And that is just so that the vehicles can sort of naturally dampen out their relative motions for one another, which was a lesson learned from the Space Shuttle Orbiter endeavor, which always had a rocking problem after docking, but the other 2 did not. So the fact that the shuttle orbiters were sort of having and demonstrating, there's something different to consider when a 250,000-pound vehicle is docking to the space station. Well, Starship bigger. Let me just put it that way. So I see where you're going with that. Let's see if SpaceX bids, and let's see if NASA actually opens it up to new vehicles first.
Yeah. My vote would be just stick a few Starships out there and make a new station. Because,
because Starships can essentially become one single launch stations. Yep.
Would be kind of
Is
cool.
it the fuel depot in orbit?
Yep.
Hey,
That's
I
a
would
space
visit.
station.
I would visit
That's
that.
going to be a space
like,
station.
I don't like
That's no
visiting gas
moon.
stations.
Yeah.
That's it's a fuel depot.
The truck stop.
Yeah.
But will they have those little hot dogs rolling on the little underneath the light bulb? All right.
True.
That joke didn't land well. Things that did land well, though, Blue Origin's was it 21? New Shepard Flight 21 landed wonderfully, and we had an awesome mission. More people. I think it was 6 more tourists, right?
It was. This was another 6-person tourism flight for Blue Origin. It happened yesterday, actually, June 4th. It was delayed a little bit because they found something with the rocket and the capsule that after the crew had actually, after the passengers. I'm going to differentiate. If you wish to call them crew, I'm not going to knock it. Personally, to me, if you go on a suborbital tourism flight, you're a passenger. If you go on an orbital flight where you're doing work, you're crew. So I'm going to call them passengers. But yeah, after the 6 passengers had arrived at the launch site, they found an issue with the booster. They delayed about 2 weeks. I believe it was from like 20th to the 4th or something like that. So not all that long. But the flight went off without a hitch, continuing to showcase something that Blue Origin has really fallen into a very good rhythm for. And I think this sort of validates and vindicates for them the very slow but methodical approach they took to developing this system and all of the uncrewed test flights that they did, some of which carried science experiments, some of which did not, right? The multiple tests of the in-flight abort system that they undertook with this vehicle, because when they started launching people 11 months ago, it was only 11 months that NS-16 launched, and there's only been 1 science flight. So 16, 17, 19, 20, and 21. So there have been 5. I may have messed up which one was the science flight, but basically they've done 5 crew flights and
Wow.
1 science flight since then. And they're really demonstrating a decent cadence here in the opening months of this of offering these tourism flights. Whereas we saw Virgin Galactic maybe take some risks on a system that was not yet ready, because we obviously heard the issues that came about, not just in violating the airspace and the warnings that took place and then firing the safety person. There have been some other stories that have been published about what happened on that flight, and they got grounded by the FAA very shortly thereafter. And then the grounding was rescinded, but then they themselves were like, no, we're going to stop and address these issues. But Blue Origin sort of worked through a lot of those in the pre-flight campaigns before they started flying passengers, and they've really hit a good cadence. I mean, it's worth noting that they have not missed. They have not lost a booster. They've not lost a capsule. They've had very good performance of the vehicles across everything. So very, very good to see this player continuing to showcase their dominance in the suborbital field, and I think we all can't wait for them to go orbital here too.
And let me just say, they do have some good footage of their booster landing. They always have the drones out, which is very nice. I think SpaceX should take some notes, and any other company who wants to do anything cool with rockets. More drones, just more drones in general. China launched the Shenzhou 14 mission to the Chinese space station. Was that this week?
That was this morning or overnight, depending on your time zone.
Because I was like, I don't really remember that.
Yeah, so it was last night Eastern time, 10:44 p.m. or 2:44 UTC. Shenzhou 14 launched to the Tiangong space station with 3 taikonauts, 2 veterans, and 1 rookie. And this is pretty cool because this marks the start of permanent habitation of the Tiangong space station. So unlike the indirect handovers that they did between Shenzhou 12 and 13 and 13 and 14, this crew is actually going up not just to do science, but to prepare and welcome the 2 science modules and the major expansion of the space station. The Wentian module is scheduled to launch on July 22nd up to the space station, up to Tiangong, and be added to it. And then a few months later in October, Mengtian is scheduled to follow, and that will complete assembly of the Tiangong space station. And that will actually enable enough room for the crew and different docking ports and different accessories there to enable direct handover. So Shenzhou 15 will launch while Shenzhou 14 is still there. And that means that as of now, we have 2 permanently crewed space stations in low Earth orbit. And if that doesn't make you smile, you're watching the wrong thing. You need to keep watching this so you know to smile. On how wonderful that is to finally be able to say. Yes.
That is really cool when you put it like that. Wow. 2 permanently crewed space stations flying around 17,500 miles an hour. That is wow. Way to go, humanity. Good job.
Indeed.
Yep. Well, so that happened last night, but something else is happening in the middle of the dark tomorrow morning. And someone's going to be there. I don't know who it is. It's not me.
I'm just going to say I'm going to be here, and I know we're going to be on comms together, Philip, but I'm just going to say I can't wait to see this thing again. And now I will defer to the SLS expert. Philip?
Yes.
My gosh.
Take it away.
My question is just, she came back to the VAB in late April. It's now early June. What did they do when they were in the VAB? And why are we going back out again?
Well, they're going out to finish what they couldn't finish in April. So they were trying to get this. They were trying to get this wet dress rehearsal test done in April, and the original plan was to roll out to the pad, do that test, come back, basically take all the test equipment off the vehicle, get it ready for launch, roll out and launch. And they just found a series of issues which they couldn't really resolve at the pad. There was, and then you have this complication of the gaseous nitrogen plant, which we'll come back to in a second. But just in terms of the repair and maintenance on the vehicle and the mobile launcher, they really don't have a service facility at the launch pad, either a mobile one like they had with Apollo or a fixed service structure like they had with Shuttle. And so they'd always intended for the system to be serviced in the VAB. And so when we'll come back to the gaseous nitrogen plant, but it does kind of it sort of integrally figures into why they came back. But they had an /issue. The first issue that they found was with a check valve in the helium system of the second stage / upper stage, the interim cryogenic propulsion stage. So in this picture here, you've got the 2 white solid rocket boosters, you've got the orange core stage, then you have a slightly less orange at the time interstage adapter, and right above that, where you can just barely make out the American flag, that's a part of the interim cryogenic propulsion stage. And then right above that, you've got the Orion, and then the Orion launch abort system on top there. So they use helium to purge lines. They use helium to actuate valves in the main propulsion system. And a check valve is like, I mean, it's the kind of thing where it's either open or closed, and the way that you open it is you push hard on one side with pressure, and that opens the valve up. But then you relax the pressure on that end of the line, and it closes. Well, what happened was they made 3 attempts in April, April 3rd, April 4th, April 14th. Well, in between the one on the 4th and the 14th, they're real busy launching Starlink missions at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, and sometimes also off of Pad 39A. So after the second attempt, SpaceX is like, hey, we'd like to, we've got some Starlinks we need to launch. So while they were doing maintenance on SLS, and while SpaceX was picking up their launch cadence again, they did some servicing on one of the helium systems out of the launch pad. And when they did that, they had to slightly depressurize the helium bottles in the stage to do that. And when they brought those back up, suddenly this check valve would no longer close. And so the problem is that the flow goes from the pad systems into the stage helium bottles. And so what you're doing is you increase the pressure on the pad side to push helium into the helium system on the stage. Well, what happened when the valve would no longer close is that's letting some helium from inside the stage systems to leak back out, kind of like if your the gas cap on your gas tank was too loose and you were pushing gas into it, you would start to have gas leaking out of your gas tank. Anyway, what they found with that was, when they got back in the VAB, was that there was some rubber stuck in the valve. And they started looking around, and what they found was, within this helium fill system, there are these rubber quick disconnect, and they're kind of like O-rings. They're rubberized seals upstream of the valve, and one of them had broken apart and gotten pushed down into the system. They found some in the, some stuck in the valve. They found some in a manifold in that system. And so they cleaned all of that up. So what it turned out was that the check valve was fine. You take the rubber out of it, which is not a part of the system in the first place, and it worked. They actually did a complete destructive evaluation of the valve, just as a part of an incident, an incident analysis, opposed, like a post-mortem on why did this fail, but the valve itself was fine. So they replaced all those rubber gaskets, and they think, because that system is now back in its design configuration, even though they don't know why that rubber gasket broke up, they feel like they're at least good to go back out to the pad and do this test. They were going to try and do the test on the 14th of April with the valve in that funky configuration, and basically what they were saying was the core stage, which is the big orange tanks here between the two boosters, the two Y boosters. That's the biggest part of the system, and that's really the focus for this test. It having the upper stage, the second stage there would be better, obviously, and they're going to involve it in this test. But they were willing to try and complete the west dress rehearsal in April without completely involving the ICPS. But then they ran into other problems, and so the problem that they ran into with the core stage on the third attempt was they had a hydrogen leak within this enclosed space on an umbilical that flows liquid hydrogen from the pad systems in through, and you can see it on the left at the base of the mobile launcher. There, you have the orange rocket. You have the white part at the bottom of the orange rocket, which is essentially the engine section. And interestingly, you can't actually see the umbilicals, which is it's kind of amazing. But there are lines that run. There are two sets of lines that run. There are two tail service masts, two plates that go into the core stage. The one which you can't. There's two of them. There's one of these gray. They're 30 feet tall. There's one behind it, which is the oxygen side. The one closest to the camera here is the hydrogen side. And so what they found was that when they got back into the VAB, there are two main lines. There's an 8-inch diameter line that flows the liquid hydrogen into the stage, and then there's a 4-inch bleed line that is used to allow liquid hydrogen, part of which is used just to keep the hydrogen components chilled down. That then is allowed to exit the stage during propellant loading. So you can see here. So in this picture, the liquid oxygen tail service mass is on the left, liquid hydrogen on the right. Within that line that runs from those gray tail service masts into the core stage, they have a debris plate, and so you have a bolted flange where the debris plate sits in between the lines. So if you had any kind of contamination that was coming from one of the pad systems in the liquid hydrogen flow, it's a screen to trap any of that contamination. And that's a bolted flange. And what they found when that flange is then encased in this kind of clamshell thing that they call a purge can. And so again, because hydrogen is very flammable, even in just regular air, during propellant loading operations, because hydrogen is so cold, you can't use nitrogen because nitrogen would liquefy or even solidify at hydrogen temperatures. But that purge can is purged with helium gas to keep the flammability down. They saw a leak within that purge can. So when they got back to the VAB, they took apart the purge can. They looked at the bolts on this bolted flange and they checked the torque readings on them, and they found that they were below spec. And so basically they were a little loose. And so what they'd said to us in some of these media briefings after the test on the 14th was they hadn't actually checked the torque on these bolts for a while. In fact, that whole system was put together probably back in the summer of last year. And so,
oh wow!
So they retorqued the bolts, and one of the things I think I heard Alex talking about this last week. One of the things that they learned from Shuttle was the way that you torque bolts like this, and you have these same type of bolted flanges for the core stage. Again, all of the structural elements, you have a 360-degree circumference around there. Well, they have these structural bolts that go around at 1-degree intervals. So you torque the bolts down, you then let them sit for, in this case, I think they were saying 24 hours or thereabouts. I think maybe it was 30 hours. And then you come back and see if you can tighten them some more. And you just keep doing that, and until you come back, you try and torque, you try and tighten them down, and you can't do it anymore. And so they applied this to the hydrogen umbilical down at the bottom of the engine section, and then they also had they went and looked at all of the other similar hardware. So they had a similar debris plate bolted flange on the oxygen tail service mast, and then they also had one on the liquid hydrogen vent line, which is up here closer to this picture, up in the inner tank area. So this is a shot again looking down overhead at the liquid oxygen on the left and the liquid hydrogen umbilical plates on the right. And you can kind of see on the right, you can see kind of a white area just outside of the outer mold line for the core stage. That's that purge can where they saw the leak. And so basically what they said, we saw this with leaks during shuttle, is they won't really know if they fixed it until they repeat the exercise and repeat the situation that they were in when they found the leak, which was when you load these cryogenic tanks, you usually start with a low flow rate to chill down the hardware from ambient conditions, from room temperature down to, in this case, we're maybe 50 degrees above absolute zero. It's very, very cold liquid. And so you gradually increase the flow rate. And what happened was the highest rate is called, well, there's chill down, there's slow fill, and there's fast fill. And that's the last one where they ran into the problem. They tried to increase the flow rate from slow fill to fast fill, and you have to increase the pressure because it's a pressure fed system. And when they did that, then they saw the hydrogen concentrations go off scale high, basically.
And like, just to give a little bit of context to what Philip's saying in terms of these leaks and, having that history and that heritage from the shuttle program, in the 90s, the shuttle program went through this series of, it was called the Year of the Hydrogen Leaks. And you guessed it, it was basically a year in which Columbia and Atlantis kept leaking hydrogen during their fueling processes. Discovery never experienced this, and we only had those three at the time, and they were never. I mean, they kept doing things. They kept trying things. They kept doing fueling tests, and they eventually stopped it. Although it was a bit of a head scratcher when they finally just changed seals and things sort of worked. And why Discovery never experienced it and the others did was always a question. And then toward the end of the program, because what Philip was mentioning, the hydrogen vent line, it's not just when you are loading the hydrogen that you have to be careful of this. You have to be careful of it when you're venting it out of the tanks in its gaseous form as it's boiling off. And toward the end of that program, there were leaks out of the hydrogen vent system for the shuttle's external fuel tank. And what they eventually tracked that to is the only thing they could think of, is they eventually tracked it to the fact that if they put half of the system on in the VAB, and then they would connect up the vent hose out at the pad. And if they did that once and tested it, it was fine. But if for whatever reason you had to disconnect it and then reconnect it, that's when it would start to leak. Why it took until 127 flights into the program to leak, never figured out. Why some leaked and some didn't upon reconnections, they never. I mean, like, hydrogen is so finicky because the smallest little leak path, and wham, you can totally blow your margins of how much concentration is around the vehicle, and totally violate your parts per million launch commit criteria. It's very easy to do with hydrogen.
Right. And yeah, and in fact, so it's really funny. I won't go too far into the export control complaining as usual, but they did say, I don't know why, I guess the limit is just like shuttle, it's 4% concentration. If you go over that, then that's a violation. And in fact, they say it's an automated propellant loading process now. So as soon as the hazardous gas detection system registered that 4% reading, the system stopped the flow of hydrogen in the vehicle. So
which is good, which is what we would want it to do.
Yeah,
right, because you don't want to you don't want things to get out of control and have a fire break out. So
now, Philip, I noticed something that was interesting, though, if I'm remembering it correctly, because there was some talk about they had to tweak something in the like system logic for what it would report, because if I understood it correctly, like the system in this purge can area, as it's transitioning to the high pressure fast fill system or rate of fueling, can actually ingest ambient air into it, and that ambient air can then maybe
That's
cause the system to think that something is going, like there's a leak, but there isn't. There was something specific they talked about there.
that was the well, okay, so those were the two main things that happened on sort of this is really on the ground side. So this issue with the hydrogen was outside the core stage. The issue with the quick disconnect on the ICPS really turns out to be the umbilical to vehicle interface. And so then what you're talking about is they fixed those. They'd originally planned to roll back out kind of mid to late May. But they had this other issue with the ICPS umbilical, which is sort of a multi-piece connection. So there's an air conditioning hose that goes into that inner stage adapter, that conical inner stage adapter between the core stage and the ICPS. But then you also have that's a modified Delta for second stage, and so the connections to the stage are essentially the same. It's just that you've put this stage on top of an 8.4 meter diameter stage instead of the same diameter, 5.1 meter diameter common booster core for Delta. What they had on the ICPS was they have this, it's called a purge boot. It's a similar kind of thing where they have an enclosed area which they're purging with helium. Again, for when you're flowing hydrogen into in through, it's not a huge compared to 8-inch diameter is gigantic compared to probably the diameter of the fill and drain for the ICPS, but you again have this area enclosed and purged with helium, and what they were seeing was with the ICPS umbilical was the hazardous gas detection system was suggesting that they were getting some type of something leaking from the outside into that purge area. And so what they decided to do with that took them longer to figure out what they wanted to do with that. And so that's why we're rolling out here on the night of June 5th into the morning of June 6th, or at least that's the plan anyway. What is this? Let's see, we're at we're about 8 hours away from the first motion. Is supposed to be about midnight Eastern time.
So in other words, 8 hours until I go to work.
Right. Actually, you'll probably have to go a little earlier than that.
I will, yes.
You're not going to be able to pull in right at the last minute.
I'll be leaving for work in 4 hours, basically.
Yes.
Yeah.
So they, for that, what they did was, it's the same thing where you don't want to have a flammability issue if hydrogen were to leak really from the outside in. In this case, they were seeing air, what looked like air coming from the outside in. Did I say that wrong? I think you don't want hydrogen gasifying and leaking inside out, and you don't want air coming in either. But what they decided to do was, rather than actually change the umbilical interface, they reseated the boot, and they essentially added another sensor to detect whether there really was any air leaking into that area, because helium should keep it from should eliminate. I'm not sure if that's true, but you shouldn't have a flammability risk with air and helium. You would have it with air and hydrogen, of course, but that's, I think, what they were talking about there. And so that was the thing that kind of tacked, I guess, another week and a half onto the schedule or thereabouts. Now, in terms of the liquid nitrogen plant, they apparently have fixed those issues. But if you look at this picture, you can see they actually have access to those two hydrogen or to those two tail service masts out at the launch pad. They just have to bring all the scaffolding out, which they were in the process of doing after that scrub back on April 14th. But one of the problems that they were having during those attempts in April was, we're talking about purges. Well, for enclosed areas where the temperature doesn't get quite so cold as hydrogen, as the boiling freezing point for hydrogen, they can use nitrogen, and that's what this white section you see here, kind of in profile, is the engine section, and that the forward skirt area up at the top of the core stage, the inner tank area between the two propellant tanks, and then the engine section, which has got all the engine plumbing, all the main propulsion system plumbing. When they're flowing cryogenics through there, the temperature just in the areas around where there's no pipes, I think they were saying back in the day, would be around 0 degrees Fahrenheit, so below air freezing temperature. So there are computer boxes in the engine section and also all around the vehicle, and so they need to be kept at a relatively reasonable temperature. So it's a dry, so low humidity, heated purge of nitrogen. Well, you have to have that in order to even start fueling the vehicle for flammability reasons. And so for the first attempt on the third, they never even got to the point where they were able to flow propellant. For the second attempt, they were ready to go, and their nitrogen purge, which is coming from this offsite plant, I think it's actually called Air Liquide. And I think if this is, ground support equipment is kind of like the referees at a sporting match. If they're doing their job with no issues, you never hear about them. But this is a shot that Julia took during one of the aerial tours. And so they supply this plant here, which is really, it's I'm not exactly sure how you would call this relative to Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, but it's south of certainly south of the Space Center grounds too. And that's State Road 3 here in the foreground. But they supply all the nitrogen, more or less, for all of the launch pads at Cape Canaveral and at Kennedy, although Kennedy is really just the two biggies. But SLS requires a lot of gaseous nitrogen, and it requires it for a long time. So on a normal tanking for the vehicle, you're probably talking about just about 24 hours of continuous high flow nitrogen that plant has to sustain. And so what they do is they have trucks with liquid nitrogen coming in. You can see a couple of them either parked up against one of those towers there, or just in a staging area. And they convert that from liquid nitrogen to gas, and then it's flowed out to the launch pads. Well, during those attempts, during the second attempt, and then twice during the third attempt, the supply crashed essentially, and they stopped getting flow. So in the first two times that it happened were before tanking, and so they just stopped. They basically put tanking on hold, and once you have a disruption in the flow, it takes about a couple of hours to get to get back up to a point where you can pick up the countdown and start, and continue. So, remember, for SLS, they only have a 2-hour launch window. So that would be an issue for a launch day if it happens again. They think they fixed everything. What happened in the second crash, though, was it was down for several hours, and they were still draining the vehicle. So they were still in kind of an unsafe configuration where they're still trying to flow liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen off the core stage and back through all those lines to the storage spheres at pad 39B. And they have these things called rechargers at a facility at the Space Center. It's called, I'm going to probably get it, I'm going to mix them up again. It's the compressor converter facility, the CCF. And that's essentially a backup, almost an emergency supply of nitrogen. And so they were able to use that to kind of limp along and finish the draining. But then they took a look at the nitrogen supply, and they realized that they needed to upgrade the facility. And the last phase of the upgrades was if you look in the back here, at the background, there are these 2 rows of 7, these ambient air vaporizers. You can see them sort of stacks there in the back near the trees.
The gray vertical structures.
Right.
Yeah.
Right in the back. Yes. So they'd set those up, but it's sort of like, it's sort of like putting a card in your computer. No, it's not. I take that back. It's sort of like putting a hard drive in your computer, but not plugging the cables in. So they'd mounted the vaporizers. They got the vaporizers set up there physically, but they had not tied them into the piping, the nitrogen piping yet. So they did that, but they weren't using those for the attempts in the first place. This other, what they're calling steam generated nitrogen, where they use steam to gasify liquid nitrogen and then flow it. And they also have these things called heat exchangers to do that. Those were having issues when they were trying to flow nitrogen at this much higher rate that they need in order to get that all the way out to the pad. And so they repaired the steam generation functionality, and they tied in those ambient air vaporizers in the back, and they ran a 30, well, now they're calling it, they said originally a 32-hour test at a higher flow rate than they needed, but they said they ended up running 34 hours sometime back in kind of mid to late May. So in theory, this problem is supposed to go away now, or it has gone away. We will find out on June 19th is currently the day that they would plan on tanking the vehicle address. So that's where we're going, which is they roll out tonight. Over the next 2 weeks, they get the vehicle ready to essentially ready for a launch. The wet dress was supposed to be a full countdown demonstration test. It's pretty much just like a launch until you get down to about 2 seconds before the engines start, and then they cut off. And then they, and then it's like a scrub. But they're going to do, I'm sure. Well, we were ready to go live a few times, I think, back in April, and we never quite got there because we never got close enough. But hopefully, we'll get there in a couple of weeks, and we can certainly talk about that more then. But
Yeah.
that's where we're going, and then whenever they finish it, then they come back. They come back to the barn. They come back to the VAB and get it ready to fly.
What a day that'll be.
We'll see.
Can't wait.
We'll see.
Yeah. Well, wow. Thank you for that, man. That was I learned a lot right there. Thank you. That was.
We all do. We all do.
Yeah. Philip has the deets. That's for sure. Thanks, man. Well, I guess there's another thing that got repaired and rolled back out. Ship 24. Starship transferring over from the Cape back to Boca Chica. Yep. Starship also had its little oopsie, and it's back out at the pad getting some new testing done. So
Well, I guess
good to see both of these getting done.
Well, and I guess
concurrently. Go ahead.
let's talk about the oopsie, right? Because we're going from big orange rocket to big shiny rocket. But yeah, what kind of happened? Because it went through a proof test, a cryo proof test, but it had to be repaired. Now we've got some Raptors being delivered. What happened, Nick? You were there.
Yeah, well, I'm there most of the time, but sometimes, like today, you're not. Got to take the day off. Yeah, so Ship 24 went through a cryogenic proof test. I guess it was a little bit over a week ago. Maybe it was 2 weeks ago. I don't know. There's time scale doesn't work down here. I'm sorry, but anyway, it did a proof test and something broke. We noticed it had a little bonk. It looked like an internal bonk. There's some tiles that kind of fell off of it and fluttered down to the ground. And pretty much immediately they discontinued the testing there for the day. And then after some time, some crews were working on that for a while. Good.
Yeah. So just to be clear, the sort of cryoproof where it didn't work successfully was last week, and then this week they came through and did it successfully. It sort of broke on the pneumatic test, and then the cryo tests under those conditions, sort of showcased that it was whatever they had done to fix it worked. as it
That's the
sort of
hope, at
got it.
least. We
Yes,
haven't
indeed.
seen another bonk yet, so that's
Yeah.
the hope.
Yeah.
But yeah, so then they moved it over to suborbital pad A, which they had installed with a bunch of hydraulic simulators to do some thrust simulation on it. And they'll be doing that testing shortly. I believe they moved that over yesterday. So that was the big exciting thing from yesterday. But yeah, so that's Ship 24. Booster 7, though, might be more interesting because it did get some grid fins, and Elon confirmed it at least has 7 Raptors on it, likely more, because the image that he showed us was from a slide deck from a presentation a while ago, and so it's probably an old image. But yeah, there's at least 7 Raptors on Booster 7, which is kind of fitting, I think, and likely means we're looking at the 13 Raptor static fire happening at some point. At some point, TM.
At some point, TM. Yes.
No guarantees.
Yeah, I sort of like that, right? Because is Ship 24 moving through cryo-proof, booster 8 getting being sort of stacked on its engine section, booster 7 getting its grid fin, like all of that, as we're sort of seeing, and the 7 Raptor 2s that are on booster 7 at this point. I mean, we kind of know that once that environmental assessment comes back, hopefully in 10 days.
8 days
or
away.
8 days.
Oh,
something
8 days.
Like that, 8 days. 10, counting.
I have a big calendar. It's right outside
yes.
my camera. It's a huge calendar. It's counting down. 8 days.
I mean, hopefully what that means is that other sequences of this test program, right, can pick back up as we head toward the orbital flight tests here, and sort of seeing those grid fins getting installed, seeing Ship 24 getting moved to Pad A, seeing the Raptors going on Booster 7. Those are all part of that, longer term goal of getting these things ready for testing ahead of their orbital flight. So hopefully that's a good indication that SpaceX isn't just hedging a bet, but that we've seen this environmental assessment take longer than initially expected, but we also know there were a lot of comments. We also know this is the first time they're doing something like this in the commercial realm, so taking the time to get it right, even if it's not as fast as we want, very important. Yeah,
has to take its time. We can't rush these big important things. So I did mention briefly there that Elon had done a all hands meeting a little bit ago, and just today, kind of randomly, he posted the slide deck from that all hands meeting, which was kind of weird, but it had some really fun details. Like we got to see the PEZ dispenser in action. There's an updated render of how the Starship will be handling Starlink PEZ dispensers, and that's the video. Thank you, Michael, for pulling that up. But yeah, the PEZ dispenser was probably okay. Raptor 2.0. Wait, I'll just pretend I'm Elon. Okay, So Raptor, there's some Raptors under Booster 7, and yeah, there's the PEZ dispenser spitting out those Starlinks. Those are huge Starlinks, by the way, much larger than the original Starlinks that we've been seeing SpaceX launch. These V2 Starlinks are much bigger because that slot is pretty big.
I gotta admit too, that's not what I thought the payload dispensing system would look like.
I can agree with that, Chris, because that was not what I was thinking.
I mean, basically, like it's just that they're stacked. They're like if I'm seeing this correctly, it's like 2 stacks of flat sats, and then 2 go out and they come down. 2 go out, the stack comes down. 2 go out, the stack comes down. Like it's okay.
I guess it'll work. I mean, hey, as long as the Starlinks get out at some point, that's all that we really care about, right?
Yeah.
So yeah,
it really is. Yeah.
Yep. So yeah, there's that, and then obviously the future stuff is probably the cooler thing that I've seen. The future Cape build out here. He posted a render shot of the Cape, and I'm only seeing 1 megabay there. I'm a little sad.
Yeah,
I was hoping we'd have like a whole field of megabays sooner than later, but yeah. So that's that on the Starship Cape front. Mike Musical Wolf says the bonk was a Doge head banging itself in Ship 24. That makes sense. I'm pretty sure that there's definitely a Doge bonk inside of Ship 24. That's definitely something that SpaceX would do, and yeah. That's pretty funny. Let's see here. Looks like I unfortunately missed a bunch of SLS super chats. Should we go back and cover those? I just noticed that in the chat queue there.
Yeah,
I'm
SLS and Starship
very
questions.
sorry.
Yeah, let's see how many we can
Yes,
do in the
let's
last 10 minutes. Yeah.
let's take the last few minutes here and get to a bunch of questions. So let's see. Oh, Nicholas has probably the best question, which would be a very nice self-plug here. Will the SLS rollout be streamed? Chris, will we be streaming the SLS rollout?
Well, I ain't going to work in 4 hours for nothing. Yes, yes, we will.
Okay.
Yes, our plan is to stream the rollout tonight. Yes, at least the first part of it. Yes.
Yep. Musical Wolves asked, did extra towels get ordered for the SLS wet dress rehearsal? Is that something I'm not aware of? Are towels important with the wet dress rehearsal?
Well, don't panic and always carry a towel is Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Ah.
So that's how I'm choosing to do it. It could also be a play on wet dress rehearsal, so more towels.
I see. That makes sense. Oh, gotta keep the Mega Moon rocket dry.
Yeah, from all the Florida storms and everything. Yeah.
Which, good luck with that, guys. Have fun.
Yeah, well, that's why
Yeah.
the lightning protection system's there. Not to keep it dry,
I
but to
thought
keep
those-
it safe. Yeah.
I thought those were 4 more rockets that were standing next to it. That's what I was thinking.
That's the joy. That you're giving away the secrets.
That's the secret. That's the secret. John asks also. Did I click on the wrong one? Also, just to be clear, the center's core stage is just a big, ginormic Delta IV tank with 4, correct me if I'm wrong, RS-25s. Is that correct?
No.
Okay.
Maybe from if you're just thinking of rockets as Legos, it's a Hydrolox a sustainer stage. I mean, it has all the basic systems, but I mean, it's if you want to think of it that way from a very basic standpoint, it's kind of like that. It's a it can't the difference between SLS and Delta IV, of course, is that the Delta IV you could have like you could have a single stick Delta IV. Those common booster cores could carry themselves off the pad. The core stage for this vehicle could not. I think maybe the thrust to weight ratio might be maybe 1-to-1, probably a little worse. So, but yeah, I mean, it's just it is a Hydrolox stage that supports 4 engines. The engines are they're also Hydrolox engines, of course, but yeah, they're I mean, I would say the differences between them are more interesting than that they're very vaguely similar in basic characteristics.
Are you telling me that this isn't actually Kerbal Space? I
No,
thought
no.
that's what it was. No, you can't just plug and play. No.
I mean, yeah, I mean,
Engineering
by
thing.
that measure, gosh, SLS has probably flown in a whole bunch of different configurations many times, and
One of
it's
the most
probably
proven-
reusable in Kerbal.
Probably
there's
is.
someone who's making portions of it reusable. Yeah, I know of
No
at least
way.
one person doing that. Yeah.
Oh, that's funny. I like that. Oh my. Justin Wayne asks a question on Air Liquide. That's how you say it, right? Air Liquide.
Yes.
Air Liquide. Is there a pipeline from the Air Liquide place to the pads, or are they constantly trucking it? Because I know with Starship they truck it all in,
It's pipe.
and it looks very
It's
inefficient.
pipes.
It's
The
pipes.
nitrogen,
okay.
it's pipes.
Okay. How big are those pipes? Like,
Oh boy, that I don't. I'd have to.
They're fairly big. I mean the pipes that run along the sides of the crawlerways are probably about
wow.
that, delivering the nitrogen on the nitrogen lines running to the pad. Yeah.
Wow, that's crazy.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. The actual propellant is stored at the pad. So
Right.
you've got those gigantic spheres with the liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen at B, and then you've got at A now you've got all sorts of stuff. You've got liquid methane, you've got liquid oxygen, and all of those types of things. So so when you have like tanker trucks going out to, you do have tanker trucks going out to both pads to the liquid hydrogen, liquid oxygen boil off of those spheres, and so they do have to be replenished regularly. So, yes.
All right, thank you. Yeah, all right. I always find it weird when they truck stuff in and out at Boca. I'm like, wait, pipes seem so much more efficient, but I'm glad that the Mega Moon rocket is using pipes. That's a good idea. John asks, when were the boosters currently on the SLS made, and how long do they have? How long will they last after the build date? Do they have to stay stable until they expire?
Yeah, so the first part of your question is a little bit tricky to answer. The steel casings that make up the actual segments are mixtures of some of them are new, some of them were made during the shuttle program, some of them are from very early in the shuttle program, pre-Challenger, so very, very early on in the program that are being reused. Then some of the things like the aft skirts, the nozzles, the nose cones are new, just to account for the differences in how the boosters were changed with the addition of the center segment. Now they were cast, meaning like the propellant was put in them back in about 2014, 2015. They were then in storage for a while, and these things can be in storage for a really long time before they have to be used. The sort of clock that you're talking about is once they are stacked with one another. The sort of seals and the pressure on the seals, and of course the seals that we're talking about are the O-rings, and everything that prevent the hot gas penetration through the actual casing segments where they come together. Um, that was originally a 1-year clock, which expired in November. That then got extended to June and July, which is now being extended again. So basically, it's sort of kind of a moving target. Northrop Grumman and NASA can do some more analyses to get comfortable with the seals, but there is a theoretical time limit on them. Now, there's obviously a lot of margin that's built in, a lot of safety considerations because of what these are, but in terms of what the actual hard, you cannot go
Boink.
past this date before destacking. We're not there yet, and they'll probably find ways to do analyses to justify keeping this going as long as the launch date is going to fall within this calendar year.
Interesting.
Yeah, they get asked about this a lot, and there are other, they call these things life limited items. So there are other things besides the motor segment stacks, and at least from we hear from upper management, they don't seem particularly concerned. It sounds like they're ready to just persist with this until they can launch. Whether that's this year, or next year, or what.
Hopefully soon.
Let's hope this year.
Yeah.
I know. Don't say next year. We got plenty of this year to get it done this year. Let's get it done this year. Musical Wolves asks, what is used to prevent the quick disconnect from leaking anything when it disconnects? And I don't think I have a good answer to that.
Yeah. So if you think about it, if you think of the disconnect. So if my closed fist is the ground side and my open palm is closed fist is ground, open palm is rocket going up. So if you think about it, the rocket inside has a valve that will close on a propellant line. And then the umbilical also has a valve that will close. And then you will flood nitrogen if it's hydrogen, you will flood nitrogen.
Helium.
Helium, sorry. You will flood helium into the space between that to inert it, right? So that anything there is not ignitable. And if it's oxygen, you usually just leave that alone. So when the quick disconnects come away, so when the quick disconnect on the ground side, right, pulls away from the launch vehicle, if you see a little puff, if you see like a sustained puff of stuff, that's usually the oxygen quick disconnect. And that's just the oxygen vaporizing and turning to gas as the umbilicals pull away. And if you don't see anything puff out of there, or you see just a little bit puff out, that's the hydrogen that has been inerted with helium. So the way you get it not to leak is there are valves on either side. There are redundant sets of valves on either side, and then you purge it with helium prior to disconnect.
Right. And they're also and also as a part of pre-launching these, during the last few minutes of the countdown, those valves on the outboard side, on the ground side, the inboard side, fill and drain valves, those are closed well before liftoff. So before you pull the plates away, those valves are closed because you have to, for instance, you have to terminate the flow, but you also need to pressurize the tanks on the rocket. I think these are gravity fed. The RS-25 engines are gravity fed, but then as you fly through the atmosphere, then you're maintaining a top pressure on the top of the tanks. So they're pressurizing the ullage space at the top of the tanks, which is relatively small when they're full. But yeah, those valves are closed first, so a couple minutes before launch, and then, like Chris said, you purge the area between the valves, and then those are basically yanked off with the liftoff signal.
Fascinating, very fascinating. Thanks for going into that detail, guys. Rough Riders Show asks, given with the now new missions, will SpaceX consider building a 5th Dragon capsule to add to the fleet? Because I think, didn't they announce that they were going to be ending production with the 4th?
So they did say that, right? That production would end with the 4th, and I know a lot of people basically said, "What? What do you mean you're stopping with 4? Why? Yeah, like why are you stopping with 4? Why not keep going with that?" And we talked a little bit about how that was fleet management and and stuff like that. And I did see a reference to a 5th Dragon capsule, but we shall wait and see.
Okay, we'll see. We'll have to wait. John asks, here's Victoria's big question. Why were/are Ship 20's flaps in the open position where everyone else gets their flaps tucked away? Well, I can answer that because it looks pretty. Ship 20's on display now. It's not doing anything. It's just there looking pretty every day. And so, leave the flaps out. Why not? It looks pretty.
Well, to be fair, the flaps are going to have to be open when you fuel it for liftoff. So
true.
Fuel test like you fly test? I don't know.
There you go. Test it like you fly.
Yeah.
I like it. Jim did leave a super chat, but he did not ask a question. So thank you, Jim Cavett. Thank you so much for your support. We really do appreciate that. John asks a question: will the center core of SLS flare up like the Delta IV Heavy?
No. That's good.
Okay.
Very good question. So the Delta IV Heavy basically, and this is where I said no to the previous question, that the SLS core stage is not basically a gigantic upsized Delta IV. Because the way the Delta IV ignites its RS-68A engine is there is a gigantic dump of hydrogen right before the ignition sequence begins, and this inundates the area with hydrogen. It's what creates the gigantic fireball when the engines actually ignite. You don't want that with crew around? Absolutely not. So the parts per million requirements for igniting the RS-25 engines are far stricter than they are for the Delta IV's engines on its core stage. The hydrogen burn-off system will be going for SLS, and you will see some flames as the ambient hydrogen that is there, but within concentration limits, does begin to burn, but it is not a whoosh as the Delta IV. Go look at how the space shuttles started its engines, and that's what you can expect to see when SLS starts its engines as well.
It's
Cool.
it's basically just the degree to which, so they're both, I'm pretty sure, but I know for sure for the RS-25s is space shuttle main engines, but they like to start and stop them hydrogen rich. So they both have this, they both have a lead hydrogen and a lag, lead during startup and lag during, it's just the RE-68 is just an extreme amount of hydrogen is dumped to start the engine.
Yeah.
And so
And that is the reason they could not human rate the Delta IV.
Oh.
There would be
interesting.
way too much ignitable hydrogen in the ambient environment if the crew had to get out of the capsule and run across an arm.
right, and they changed the start sequence for the Heavy because you know, which basically starting one of the three way ahead, so to speak, milliseconds scale. And then that basically operates like a hydrogen burn off igniter for the other two CBCs.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, Stefan Battist has asked the final super chat of the day. Chris G. This is a question directed to you, Mr. Gebhardt. You are my favorite NSF member. Are you going to be in Matt Lowe's his KSP series where he rescues famous people? Scott Manley was in it yesterday.
I would be honored if I was in a video where Matt had to go rescue. So he does these really cool videos where you have to go rescue stranded Kerbals from around the Kerbin system. I'd be honored if I was one of them. Yeah, I'd want to know. I'd want the backstory on how I got lost. But hey, that means I got in a rocket, so I'd be happy.
Hey, that'd be kind of fun.
It's probably just coming with air conditioning. That's probably the thing.
Yeah, true. Depends on the planet we're on.
Yeah. Well, cool. Well, thank you guys for all of your support and all of your great questions. You guys really make these shows what they are. Thank you for the support and helping us keep the lights on, and all the super chats and channel members. And just thank you so much. It's an honor to even be able to do this. So thank you all for joining. Also, I think we have to give a shout out to the shirt that some of us are wearing. Maybe a place where you can find said shirts.
Yeah.
Do we have a store, Chris? Do we have a store?
We do. You can get various different types of merchandise. We've got some Starliner stuff, some Raptor stuff. You can also find our SLS shirts that are on there for tonight as Artemis 1 rolls on out to the launch pad again. You can also get your huggable SLS and your They See Me Rollin', They Hatin' shirt.
That's a clever one.
Yeah,
I love that shirt.
Yeah, Pauline does a great job with these designs. She really does. But yeah, go ahead and get your Artemis swag in preparation. Well, you won't have it for the rollout, but you can have it for the wet dress campaign. And if you want some other stuff with Raptor engines, with some generic human spaceflight ones as well, we definitely have you covered in our store if you want to head on over to there. And I did just want to shout out to our launch director members too, just because that is the highest level of membership, and we do have many of them, and that's really humbling and awesome. So in addition to what Nick said, just a personal thank you from me there, because it's that type of support that enables me to be deployed at midnight for a rollout of a rocket, and for us to bring you that stream a little later on. So if we didn't get to your SLS question here today, join us for that stream, which we're aiming to start before rollout. We'll go live before first motion. Don't worry. Stay tuned to social media for that. But yeah, definitely get your questions ready for SLS rollout, because that's when we can really deep dive more than we did today.
Nice. Thank you all for joining us, and see you guys next week.
Thanks, Nick.
Propulsion continues to be nominal.
RCP chamber pressure looks good. Toggling up. Roger roll, Atlantic.
Water towers fly! Yes!
Tango Delta nominal.
Flight number feet off. Bring in NC off.
Yikes. You bet. Concur. We don't need any more of these.